The Hungarian Grand Prix has shown us a side of Verstappen that we didn't think we would be seeing after the 2021 championship. However, the emotions got the best out of him, and the actions on the track reminded us of the era where he had the inferior car and had to chase extremely hard for an overtake. The collision with Hamilton in turn 1 almost took him and the Brit out of the race, but with the RB20 no longer being the most dominant car on the grid, and it vastly depending on the Verstappen's talent, could this be the sign that the Dutchman will be back in his elbows out form like he was before? It's safe to say that Verstappen's actions during the Hungarian Grand Prix were all but justified, starting from the reactions towards his pit wall and ending with the crash that happened in turn 1 between him and Hamilton in the closing stages of the race, one that the Dutchman blamed Hamilton for because of braking under moving. However, even his team principal, who is one of the most disciplined and calmed people on the grid, didn't stand in defense of Max, and when the 3-time world champion complained about a potential investigation against Hamilton, Lambiase said, "I'm not even going to get into a radio fight with the other teams, Max. We will let the stewards do their thing. It is childish on the radio. Childish." In a different situation earlier in the race, such as the opening lap, Verstappen believed that he was ahead of Norris when he was pushed outside of the track, when his team instructed him to give the position back to not risk any further penalty that could have hindered his race. To this, Verstappen's reaction was again furious and sarcastic, as he went on to say, "Okay, so you can just drive people off the track then. You can tell the FIA that that's how we're going to race the whole race." Bear in mind that this is a 3-time world champion that we're talking about, one that scored more than 100 podiums and won 62 races in his career, and obviously the shenanigans that he's been doing since the 2016-2021 era seem to be back. The emotional side of Verstappen is always going to be present, and there are certainly some reasons to do so. For the first time in 3 years, he doesn't have the luxury of winning a race with 20 seconds of advantage and then going for a free pit stop just to gain the fastest lap of the race. When you're that far ahead, there's nothing to be angry about, and you cannot blame anybody because you're just lapping drivers over and over. However, Verstappen seems to be forgetting quickly that the same pit wall that he's been blaming for the strategy is the one that put him P2 in Silverstone, as 2 weeks ago he was praising the strategy team for how they executed the pit stops perfectly. When talking about the strategy in Hungary, Verstappen went on to say, "It is quite impressive how we let ourselves get undercut and completely ruin my race." But nevertheless, the statement that Verstappen just made is something that should worry all the drivers on the grid, especially the ones who will fight more frequently with him at the front, such as Norris, Hamilton, Piastri, or maybe even Leclerc. The damage that he sustained from the slam of his floor wasn't enough for him to retire the car or to lose significant amounts of downforce, which he should be lucky enough for. But when Lambiase told him that he should be checked by a medical steward, as that is routine procedure when a driver participates in such a crash, Verstappen went on to say with an angry voice, "Let them send that medical delegate to the stewards to see if they're okay. I'm completely fine." It doesn't really take a genius to understand that this is childish behavior, but it also shows a pattern that should worry Red Bull as well. Verstappen usually doesn't act well when he lets the emotions extract the worst behavior out of him. For example, the 3-time world champion hasn't been the best when he tried to defend against Hamilton in 2021, and most of the time, both of them ended the race prematurely. This would have happened a lot more times had it not been for Hamilton backing out of a duel. A similar situation was also present in Austria this year, where Verstappen didn't leave a car's width to Norris, but wasn't as angry because at the end of the day he finished P5 while his rival had to retire the car. However, when Norris tried to overtake Verstappen with damaged machinery, Verstappen blocked the way even though he had a punctured tyre and couldn't drive the car properly, showing that these manners are not something that's going to go away quickly. Obviously, this is one of the rare times where Red Bull managed to get outsmarted by Mercedes, because for the majority of the first stint, it was Hamilton who managed to keep himself within a second of Verstappen, which is why the Silver Arrows decided to pull the trigger first and pit Hamilton for an undercut process, one that seemed to be successful both of the times that it's been done. In the second pit stop, Verstappen also had to catch Leclerc, who was doing extremely well on the medium tyre, and even though he got rid of the Monegasque driver after a couple of races of chasing, he still finished behind him due to the incident with Hamilton in turn 1. During the third stint, Verstappen pushed extremely hard on the medium tyre to cut down as much time to Leclerc as possible, and within a handful of laps the difference dropped from 6 to 2 seconds, and when Verstappen got into a DRS zone of Leclerc, he received quite an interesting message from his radio engineer. Well, that's some gentle introduction. While the medium compound tyres are faster than the hard ones that Hamilton had for the third choice of tyres, they tend to degrade faster, which is why the team wanted Verstappen to nurture his tyres a bit better. But his response was definitely something that aggravated a lot of F1 fans and potentially everyone in his team, as he went on to say, "No, don't give me that stuff now. You guys gave me the effing strategy, okay? I'm trying to rescue what's left, for God's sake." You probably understood that many of those words in the statement were explicit, and that Verstappen went on a full-mode rant on the radio, which is why the question of whether we're going to see the old, emotion-driven version of Verstappen back on the grid is a valid one, and one that should worry the rest of the grid. Again, in Austria, we've seen that Verstappen has moved continuously under braking, something that the FIA has also agreed should have been penalised a lot earlier, and maybe even avoided the accident, as he wouldn't have done the same when the accident actually happened. Nevertheless, a lot of things can be said in hindsight, and the most important one right now is that Verstappen doesn't seem to be the best version of himself, which primarily is because he doesn't have the best car in his hands. Although he was and still is praised for the amount of performance he extracted out of the RB20 week in and week out from Miami onwards, it seems like the developments made by the teams like McLaren and Mercedes are just too much to handle. What is worth mentioning is that in the last two races, we've had a front row lockout from Mercedes and McLaren, respectively, and in the Hungarian Grand Prix, McLaren managed to finish 1-2, even though they also had some internal problems to solve between Norris and Piastri when it came to who would have won the race. But nevertheless, the difference in the Constructors' Championship is now very low, only 51 points in favour of Red Bull. While many hoped that if there was someone who could salvage the season, it would be Verstappen, now that doesn't seem like a realistic scenario, at least not in the Constructors' Championship. Even though the lead in the Drivers' Championship is still solid, standing at 76 points, with a better strategy from McLaren, it could have easily gotten down to 69. In a competitive season like this, every point counts, and had it not been for the dominance that Red Bull established in the first 5 races, as well as the blunders that McLaren made in circuits like Canada and Silverstone, as well as the sprint races in China and Imola, it would have been a much more interesting season to this point. Nevertheless, Verstappen does seem like a loose cannon right now, and that could definitely go both ways for Red Bull. It would either unleash a version that we haven't seen from himself, one that was present in 2021 in terms of not breaking under pressure, or one that wouldn't care whether he threatens the FIA with his own words, and one that would be a menace for the grid. It would also be up to the FIA to sanction these behaviours, as both Verstappen and Hamilton were called up for a talk after the race, even though the 7-time world champion was at no fault for what happened in Turn 1. With all of this in mind, do you think that Verstappen's emotions will become something too much to control? And what is even more important, do you think that it would lead to the inevitable process of leaving Red Bull after all of the internal drama and slump of performance, as well as the massive PR that Mercedes has been doing for him in the past couple of months? Let us know in the comments below, and once you do that, make sure to click on the video that's appearing on your screen right now.